On a warm September 1943 day in Westminster, California, Soledad Vidori was taking her two daughters, Alice and Virginia Vidori, and her niece and two nephews, Sylvia Mendez, Gonzalo Mendez Jr., and Jerome Mendez, to the Westminster Main School to enroll them. Upon arrival, the secretary stated, "We'll take those," indicating the Vidori children, "but we won't take those three." The Vidori children had a visibly lighter skin and a last name that sounded acceptably French, and were allowed to attend the school. The Mendez children were to attend the Mexican school. What follows is a story of Mexican Americans standing up for their rights. This led to a case that broke the barriers of segregation and discrimination imposed on Mexican Americans that had been widespread throughout the Southwest. The case was the first federal lawsuit openly to challenge the separate but equal doctrine that sent a ripple effect to all minorities to break their own barriers. The case would set the groundwork for the 1954 case of Brown v. Board of Education that desegregated the nation. This case would come to be known as Mendez v. Westminster, a shining light on school desegregation and Mexican American rights. In 1910, the Mexican Revolution roared to life. Violence and death brewed throughout the country as war shook the land of Mexico. Many Mexicans were looking for an escape and a brighter future. Therefore, a mass number of Mexicans immigrated northward into the southwest of the United States, brewing a fear of the other. Fear and stigmatization of Mexican immigrants that would lead to decades of discrimination grew in the minds of Anglos. And that mass number of immigrants was Gonzalo Mendez and his family. Gonzalo and Felicitas Mendez both immigrated from Mexico and Puerto Rico respectively, landing in Westminster, California, where they married. In 1943, their banker informed Mendez of the Minomitsu family, a Japanese-American family that had been forced to relocate to an internment camp. The Mendezes leased the Minomitsu's farm until their return. They moved back to Westminster, where shortly Gonzalo's sister Soledad would register her children and the children of Gonzalo into the main school, where the Mendez kids would face a barrier of discrimination. "We were too dark," Gonzalo Mendez Jr. would later recall. In response, Gonzalo attempts to negotiate with the principal, the Westminster School Board, and the Orange County School Board to no avail. The Mendezes were determined to end what they saw as a clear injustice. Mendez was recommended to see the attorney David C. Marcus. Marcus had recently won a case where Mexican Americans were denied access to the public swimming pool in San Bernardino. Marcus suggested in order to have a strong case, they had to prove that the segregation was widespread. They scoured for evidence and came up with a multitude of families who had faced the same barriers. Mendez and groups of parents petitioned and attempted to negotiate with the school board, while Gonzalo's daughter, Sylvia, was attending the Mexican school.
Because the Mexican school was a horrible school with no playground, and it was right next to a cow pasture. I remember that there was a fence around the cows that had a little bit of electricity on it, and that was the fence between the school children and the farm. The school books were all handed down so they'd be torn, and we were being taught how to be good maids. We were being taught how to clean, how to sew, how to quilt. We weren't being taught academics.
The school board, in response to the family's petitions, offered to make an exception for the Mendez children only. However, this was not sufficient for Mendez and Marcus, as they wanted all children to be integrated, forcing them to take legal action. In the current time period, it was legal to segregate Asian Americans and Native Americans in California, but not Mexican Americans. Legally, they were considered white, but this legal whiteness did not equate equal treatment. With this knowledge, David Marcus would argue that Mexican Americans were being systematically segregated on the basis of ethnicity, in hopes to attack the barrier of segregation altogether. He would use the 14th Amendment to argue, as stated in the filed petition, that said regulation, segregation, is unconstitutional, illegal, and void, and is being enforced by such discriminatory conduct in practice. For the cause and reasons as stated, violative to petitioners' rights and privileges as citizens of the United States. On March 2, 1945, David Marcus filed a petition with the district court. The petitioners named were the Mendez family, along with the Guzman family, the Palomino family, the Estrada family, and the Ramirez family. The respondents were the full school districts, Westminster, Garden Grove, El Modena, and Santa Ana. Following the petition, the national news paid no attention, and the local news had little to no coverage. The case was assigned to Judge Paul J. McCormick, who set the date for trial on July 5, 1945. Before the trial, the lawyers on both sides would appear before him in a pre-trial hearing to determine the evidence. It is here where George F. Holden, the defendant, argues that the court lacks jurisdiction over the subject matter, and the school districts deny that they are segregated solely for the reason that they are of Mexican descent and claim that they are segregated for the benefit of the people. Judge McCormick would decide whether the federal courts had jurisdiction after hearing the plaintiff's witnesses. Throughout the trial, George Holden would argue that Mexican American students were being segregated in order for them to learn English and assimilate. He would mention that due to Plessy v. Ferguson, it was legal to separate as long as it was equal. David Marcus, on the other hand, would argue that Mexican American children were not treated equally by attending second-rate schools and were not given adequate language assessment before inclusion in the Mexican schools. The most shocking piece of evidence found in the trial was the thesis entitled Segregation of Mexican School Children in Southern California by James L. Kent. Kent was the school superintendent of Garden Grove, and in his thesis, he argued that all Mexican students should be segregated. It stated, "The Mexican race is of a less sturdy stock than the white race. Personal hygiene of the Mexican people is deplorable. A curriculum based upon their abilities would probably help solve the problem of assisting the Mexican in becoming a worthwhile citizen." His thesis exacerbated the already existing barriers caused by stigmatization of Mexican Americans. Further into the case, an innovative piece of evidence used in the trial were testimonies from social scientists who spoke on the negative effects of segregation. Ralph L. Beals, an anthropologist, stated that a feeling of antagonism is built up in children when they are segregated in this fashion. The disadvantage of segregation would come primarily from the reinforcing of stereotypes of inferiority-superiority. This new strategy foreshadowed the use of social science experts in Brown v. Board of Education. The final case verdict from Judge McCormick came on February 18, 1946, in the form of conclusions of the court. He ruled in favor of the plaintiffs, a victory for Mendez. He concluded by stating, "A paramount requisite in the American system of public education is social equality. It must be open to all children by unified school association, regardless of lineage." A radical statement for his time that broke the barriers of segregation and discrimination. He inherently declared that separate but equal cannot be equal. This anticipated the Supreme Court by almost a decade. Following Judge McCormick's ruling, the school districts filed objections on March 26, 1946 to the Court of Appeals. Suddenly, Mendez was news. From the Orange Daily to the Los Angeles Times, everyone started getting involved and sending in their own briefs. The NAACP, the American Jewish Congress, the Japanese American Citizens League, the National Office of the ACLU, and others all got involved. On April 14, 1947, the judges in the Court of Appeals in San Francisco unanimously ruled in favor of the Mendez family. All the families who had fought for their rights in the Mendez case were now able to integrate and live their full rights as Americans. This was not the only effect felt of the Mendez case. 2 months after the ruling, the legislature of California passed Assembly Bill 1375, which eliminated all segregation in California schools. Governor Earl Warren signed the bill into law. Earl Warren would later become Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court when Brown v. Board of Education was heard. The same strategies and decisions made in Brown v. Board of Education paralleled the same ones in Mendez v. Westminster. Mendez v. Westminster sent ripples all throughout the Southwest, encouraging others to break their own barriers. From the desegregation cases of Delgado v. Bastrop Independent School District to Gonzalez v. Chile, Mendez v. Westminster provided a precedent for other minorities to stand up and fight for their rights. Mendez v. Westminster today is regarded as a landmark case that was pivotal to challenging the practice of segregation in regard to the separate but equal doctrine. It broke the barriers of segregation and discrimination that had plagued the U.S. Not only did it lay the groundwork for Brown v. Board of Education, but also served as a shining light. A shining light that proved when you encounter an injustice and take action, others will follow. For all the minorities at the time, it demonstrated that the American dream is possible.
Well, I'm proud. I'm proud that at least we had the courage to do it, to fight for, not for our children, but for the other children, their children and their children, and for all the communities.